Welcome to the SciPhi Show, where we talk science and philosophy with two of my favorite atheist thinkers, Alex Malpass and Dan Linford. And today we're going to be looking at one of the darlings of the American conservative right, Ben Shapiro, and his arguments for God. We might even do this as a two-parter. We'll see how we do for time. Now, people have commented on Ben's arguments before, but I think they're worth revisiting given the current political situation in the USA today. But before we do, Dan, I want to know, I'm kind of wondering what it's like. What's the vibe like in the US right now? Because obviously Alex and I are in England. We're on the other side of the pond. And give us some insight.
I mean, I think things are a bit grim. Actually, for the most part, I haven't really been paying too much attention, to be completely honest. But in part, that's because it feels as though there's very little that I can do. So that I'm not in a position of significant power, and the things that I can contribute to, I'll continue contributing to them. And if people want to make us aware of some kind of project that they have going, they can feel free to comment that in the comments beneath this video. That's something that I would certainly be open to. But at the moment, that seems like the sort of general perspective that this administration has is to move fast and break things, and they are breaking a lot of things that are going to affect a lot of people, including a lot of people that voted for him. So it's I think part of what I hope is that as this goes on, people come to realize that this maybe isn't what they wanted, and that it doesn't give a solution to the problems that they wanted resolved. I think there are a lot of real problems that the U.S. is facing in terms of inflation and unemployment, issues that the Republicans talk about a lot. I don't think that Trump and his administration have a realistic solution, or even a productive solution of any kind, to those problems. In fact, my thought is that it's very likely that the things that he's doing are going to exacerbate those problems. But what I hope is that on the one hand, I would love to be wrong about him exacerbating those problems. If I'm not wrong about that, then I would love for people to eventually come to see that this isn't a good way forward.
Yeah, Alex, any thoughts looking on? I'm just thinking horror. What about you?
I can't even bring myself to focus on it. It's too sad, really. Let's just take the piss out of Ben Shapiro instead.
Yeah, let's do that. Let's do that. Okay.
Well, in terms of things that we can actually contribute to, this at least is something that we can do.
Right, exactly. Because Ben Shapiro is one of the cheerleaders for Trump.
Yeah.
So let's have a look at his first argument. I was going to say not for Trump, for God, but I don't know. Are they kind of the same in some people on the American right? Maybe Trump is some sort of messiah figure to them. I kind of think so. But let's take a look at his first argument.
Let's begin with the idea that God is an unnecessary hypothesis. It's difficult to imagine an argument in which God is utterly unnecessary. That is because all human logic is rooted in certain basic assumptions about the nature of the world and about reason that are completely unmoored from the dictates of evolutionary biology. First, we make claims of objective truth that exists independent of human minds. How does such truth exist? Based on the dictates of evolutionary biology, our ability to comprehend a truth should really be no more than our ability to think whatever is most evolutionarily beneficial for us and our genetic descendants. But we don't believe that we think 2 + 2 = 4 because it's evolutionarily beneficial. We believe 2 + 2 = 4 always and everywhere because it's true. And that bespeaks a truth beyond the merely material.
Alex, why don't you kick us off with this one?
It's so smack your head against a brick wall bad, isn't it? It's just so fucking bad. Because the guy does sort of punts around trying to pretend that he's super, super smart. He's the cool kid's philosopher, apparently. But I don't know. I think he has a master's in law or something. But he's no qualifications in philosophy. He's not a philosopher. He's not even a kind of just one of these smart people who's good at philosophy or something. he's terrible. He's all over the place. So like, let's just see. To begin with, he says that there's something about like God not being a necessary hypothesis or something. Sorry, was that what he? How did he phrase it at the
Hang on,
beginning?
I've
It was a
got the
weird way of
text
phrasing.
here. What does he say? God. Let's begin with the idea that God is an unnecessary hypothesis. It's difficult to imagine an argument in which God is utterly unnecessary.
Yeah, it's really weird. Like terminology is really weird. Like I don't know what you mean an unnecessary hypothesis. Does he mean like that the proposition God exists is contingently true rather than necessarily true or something? What's he talking about?
I think what he has in mind is this idea that you might get from someone like Laplace, right? So Laplace famously was asked why he didn't have God in his hypothesis about the origins of the solar system, and his reply, I mean, I think this story is actually apocryphal, as it turns out, but in any case, it's said that his reply is that he had no need for that hypothesis.
Yeah.
And of course,
Dan, you're saying Laplace never actually said that?
Well, this, I haven't looked into this very deeply, but my understanding is that the story about Laplace is thought by historians to be apocryphal. Again, so if I'm mistaken about that, then I invite people to comment down in the comments in this video. But that was my understanding anyway. But in any case, it's a common refrain that people make, right? That that we don't need to postulate God because he doesn't do any real explanatory work. And then I think the argument that Shapiro is making is that somehow reason or logic itself, or maybe science itself, requires not just absolute truth, but God, and that's why we can't do without that hypothesis. I think that's what he's saying.
He's trying to say that, and he's also sort of bringing in, I guess, Plantinga's argument.
It seems that that's exactly what he's doing. It's Plantinga's argument.
Yeah, because like, what the hell has? I guess what we're saying is that God is necessary in order to explain logic or something, in order to be the kind of metaphysical grounding for logic, without which it becomes some like difficult to explain thing. What the fuck's that got to do with evolutionary biology? Like, like evolutionary biology doesn't provide a metaphysics of logic. Who thinks that it does, right? And the reason that he's scared is just because he's not careful with these concepts. He's not using them like an expert. But I just think that he's making this quite simple blunder between a question about ontology and a question about epistemology. He just sort of switches between the two things. I think he says something, starts off saying it in terms of like, what is logic if God doesn't exist, or what is truth, or stuff like this. And then he's saying, but if evolutionary biology is true, then we couldn't come to know these truths because they don't provide some survival advantage. I think that's what he's saying. He's making a kind of epistemological point that's just completely independent of the ontological one. I mean, you might think, and I'm not saying I think this, but an atheist might say, I just don't think you can come to know logical truths or something, like know them in a strong sense, because my cognitive capacity is like not good enough or something. But I can just believe that they're true and still do logic and stuff. I just think that somehow I'm forbidden from having a really secure grasp on the axioms of it or something, in which case I don't know them. Evolution doesn't provide me access to do that, but I can still do logic anyway. And then so what? What now? Like, you can't just, because the point is that, like, if we're talking about like the foundations, like the ontological grounding of logic, any epistemological concern could just be shrugged off. Like, it doesn't matter if I can't know it. That doesn't mean the metaphysical picture is thereby impossible. I mean, the two things are completely different to each other. So I think there's a really rookie basic mistake, and I hope I'm not being uncharitable in that. I think he really does just not get the slide from basically ontology to epistemology.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a whole lot that's going on culturally in the background here. That one thing that is often claimed is that if you give up some kind of traditional religious belief, then you give up absolute truth and you slide into nihilism and subjectivism, as if those two views were themselves compatible, right? But I think there's another thing going on here too. There's another elementary error that he's making. So he says, if evolutionary biology provided an explanation for the existence of human beings and for human cognition, then it would have to be the reason that you believe that 2 + 2 = 4 would be in virtue of the survival advantage that it confers. And of course, that's just not true, right? So even if the entire evolutionary picture is correct, and even if there were some kind of problem, some kind of epistemological problem that evolution is supposed to pose, it's just not going to be true that all of our beliefs come from the genes that we happen to possess, right? With the kind of like sophisticated organism that human beings happen to be, we acquire our beliefs over the course of our lives from living our lives, from our interactions with others, from living in communities, and whatever beliefs are most intuitive to have, given whatever our origins might be. Those intuitions are often corrected by our observations of the world, right? So yeah, it's not true that we evolved to believe that 2 + 2 = 4. I don't see why that's relevant, right? Like this doesn't. Here's another point that I think is a really important elementary mistake that he's making. Suppose he's right that if evolution was true, we wouldn't have a good account of why it is human beings believe that 2 + 2 = 4. Well, in that case, it would mean that there are various facts about human beings that evolution can't explain. It wouldn't mean that theism is true. And in fact, it wouldn't provide any evidence for theism, right? I mean, if you want to say that it does provide evidence for theism, then you have to say, for instance, that the theistic hypothesis makes that observation more likely or something like that. And that it not only provides evidence for theism, but that it provides sufficiently strong evidence for theism, right? Because you could be in this situation where every hypothesis that's been offered is improbable. For some hypotheses, we have some degree of evidence, but there's no hypothesis for which the evidence is so strong that it rationally compels belief. And for everything that he said, we could well be in that situation, even if you take on board all of the statements that he's made in his favor, right? None of those are going to suffice to get you to theism.
I'm wondering if there's an issue about true beliefs. So the argument is with evolution, we shouldn't think that we should have true beliefs. We just have beliefs to aid our survival. And I guess survival and reproduction, actually, rather than just survival. But can we not flip it around and say, well, what about false beliefs? Like if you're saying, well, with theism, now we have true beliefs. Now we can trust our beliefs and so on. What about all the false beliefs that people have? There are more than 100 different cognitive biases that humans have. So if you're going to say, okay, with theism now we can trust our beliefs, isn't the existence of those more than 100 different cognitive biases some evidence against that hypothesis? Or is that, I don't know, how does that fit in?
So there's a paper by, I believe the philosopher's name is John Park, on something called The Problem of Error. And it pursues precisely this question. So the one way to come at this question is by first taking a look at what it is that Descartes has to say. So Descartes wanted to give an account of how it is that we could trust our senses in the first place. And what Descartes says is that if God exists, and Descartes thought that he could rationally prove that God exists, that if God exists, then God would endow us with reliable senses. But then the problem is that our senses turn out not to be reliable. And it turns out that for all kinds of things, our senses are systematically unreliable. And they're unreliable in a way that you might find problematic given a conception of a God that is supposed to form a personal relationship with us, is supposed to love us. I mean, for instance, human beings are... so there's a paper of mine where I make the following kind of point, that we are inclined towards what many theologians would think of as idolatrous belief, right? That most people, given the kinds of faculties, given the kinds of intuitions they have about the divine, tend not to form beliefs that are quote unquote theologically correct. And that, you might think, prevents relationship with whatever divinity there might actually be. People systematically form incorrect beliefs about ethics. So a really widespread issue is that people confuse their feelings of disgust with their feelings of moral approbation, and that is not something you would expect a morally benevolent being to endow us with, right? Such a being would, even if other kinds of mistakes are okay for us to make, it causes really big problems that people get morality wrong. And even if you want to say that, so I would want to say that one of the reasons why like homophobia is widespread is that people conflate morality with their feelings of disgust.
Dan, I got to interrupt you because it's funny. Literally the other night, I was having dinner with a friend, and we were talking about this very issue. That I said, actually, when men watch pornography, they often are turned on by straight men.
Mm-hmm.
They're often turned on by men and girls, but they kind of get a feeling of disgust with guys and guys.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a sense of disgust which is like your taste, right? Like I find semolina pudding disgusting, but I don't think that it's immoral, right? And I was saying to someone, I wonder if that sense of moral disgust and sort of taste disgust, maybe they happen in the same part of the brain, maybe they get confused, and maybe that's one of the reasons why people are sort of homophobic, because they're confusing a sort of taste disgust with a moral disgust. And literally the other night we were talking about this, and is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, so that's exactly right. There's a philosopher, there's a friend of mine, Daniel Kelly at Purdue University. He wrote a book on disgust that makes exactly this kind of point. We should have him on the podcast sometime in the future. But here's a further point about that. I mean, suppose that some religious conservative is watching this program and they say, "Oh, but homosexuality is morally wrong." Well, it's also like, regardless of whatever views you have about morality, people have such a diversity of views about morality that no matter who you are, you're going to think that most people get it wrong, right? So the problem here isn't just that, like, from my perspective, there's some group of people who happen to be systematically mistaken about morality. Rather, it's that whatever your view about morality happens to be, you're going to think that most people get morality wrong. And that most people have intuitions that lead them systematically astray, and that entire cultures have gone astray, and so on and so forth. That, it seems to me, is something that we wouldn't have expected on the hypothesis that there's a God who endows us with our cognitive faculties, because our cognitive faculties, when it comes to morality, are apparently not systematically truth tracking.
Right. And one of the cognitive biases I think is perhaps the most important is the fact that we discount the future risk too incorrectly. Like we don't take the risk in the future to have the right values. Like we basically say they're not very important when they are very, very important. And that
because
particular
Jesus is coming back any day now, so it doesn't matter about
right.
it.
Well, indeed. No, well, that's related because, of course, one of the reasons that maybe we're not tackling climate change is one, this cognitive bias. And there's actually research that the Christian belief that Jesus is coming back any day is another reason. So those sorts of intuitions are not what we might expect a good God to give us, but given the enormous damage that they are doing.
Yeah, I think though I've always thought that the evolutionary argument isn't supposed to say on theism everybody has completely true beliefs or something. I mean, obviously that's not couldn't possibly be the claim; it'd be ridiculous. Rather, the idea is just supposed to be something like atheists having any true beliefs would just be chance or something, be very unlikely. Whereas for a theist, on theism, I guess is what I mean. The idea that you would have at least some true beliefs, core true beliefs or something, is the sort of thing God might want you to have, and there you go. And that's so. Just to be clear about it, I'm just saying, like, the fact that any old psychological bias or pathology or something isn't itself necessarily like overwhelming evidence against theism. It doesn't give us like very strong reason to think there wouldn't be any pathologies.
Right, I think that's right. But I think what's important is that we have certain kinds of biases, and the kinds of biases, the kinds of cognitive faults that we are apparently naturally endowed with, for whatever reason, are not the ones that you might have expected on theism, right?
Yeah.
They're the ones that theism sort of poorly predicts. Even if maybe God is okay with, even if you would on theism predict that there's other kinds of errors that are completely consistent with theism.
Right, and I would just say that, of course, Plantinga would not think that everyone has true beliefs and all, and God would implant that. But I think he owes us an account of the more than 100 cognitive biases and say, okay,
and I want to make
how does this fit in?
Right. I want to make one further point, which is that Plantinga himself has an account of this, right? At least when it comes to the errant religious belief, where he would say that, well, we're fallen and we deny God and our unrighteousness and all this stuff. But those are further auxiliary hypotheses that have to be added to the core hypothesis of theism, and they are auxiliary hypotheses that have to be added in order to account for all of this data, right? So the question is whether or not those auxiliary hypotheses are probable given the core hypothesis of theism, and I would maintain that they're not, right? So even though you can invent a theistic hypothesis that explains all of that variation in, say, moral intuition and so on, it's, I don't think, a very good hypothesis, because it has two parts that are in tension with one another.
Right. And interestingly, I mean, Shapiro obviously is Jewish, and when I was brought up Jewish, and the idea of original sin just, I mean, yeah, the story of Adam and Eve is there, but it just doesn't have that sort of import in Judaism. So I'd love to hear what Ben Shapiro thinks is his account of all our false beliefs and cognitive biases, how that fits in with his theory. But
right, but
how are we going to get it?
He doesn't provide anything, and really what's going on is just shit throwing at what he thinks is atheism, but really it's a sort of I remember talking to you about this, Dan, probably 10 years ago, about this. Most apologetics sort of works on this assumption that atheists are reductive, materialist, scientific, whatever, right? They box them in with loads of exactly. That's the only things you can know are through science or something. Nothing, you can't know anything any other way. And to explain everything, you have to resort to explanations in terms of the movement of particles or something. And you know what?
Right.
I do think that if you hold that type of view, I don't know if Churchland really does hold that view, but that's the kind of cliche person who's a sort of physicalist or whatever. But suppose you did hold that view, maybe Epicurus thinks that or something. I do think you've got some story to tell about what logic is and how there can be things that look like abstract ideas or propositions, that type of thing. I do think that materialist owes the rest of the philosophical community some kind of explanation of what do you mean then by logic and laws and morality or whatever. They have to say something. But the simple point is just that an atheist doesn't have to be that guy. They can help themselves to different ontological pictures. It's not just
we can all belong to the Church of Plato. And,
right. Yeah. but it's just they're just orthogonal questions. I mean, you can be like William Lane Craig is a theist, but he doesn't believe in abstract objects, right? He's I'm blanking on the word. What the hell? But
he's a nominalist.
A nominalist, exactly. Yeah. So he's not a theistic conceptualist. Doesn't think that the nature of abstract objects is grounded in God. For instance, the nature of truth. For instance, presumably Craig doesn't think that's to the extent that that's an abstract object. It's not grounded in God in a kind of Platonic way. But it seems like Shapiro thinks that his picture is so unsophisticated that he thinks there's just two groups. And over here, you've got theism. They can have abstract objects. They can have a rich ontology with all sorts of different types of things, material, but also other stuff. And over here, the atheist has this impoverished sort of resources. And all they can, if you can't explain why 2 + 2 = 4 in terms of atoms bumping into each other, then game over. Right? And that's all he has to do is just say, this side is shit because they can't explain this thing. But it doesn't entertain the thought that maybe the atheist can have additional resources, but he also doesn't bother to think, well, I should probably explain more about how do you get truth on theism? What does that even mean? I mean, I can understand that there's a problem for the materialist, but I'm not really sure unless you say something like, well, it's basically a Platonic object or something. It feels to me it's just an additional concept you need on theism as well, like the nature of truth. Something has to be true. It has to be true that God exists or whatever. It has to be true that God grounds metaphysical blah, blah, blah. So you still have to have a concept of truth at play. And it's difficult to see how that could also be, that can't be that everything is grounded in God. I think that's whole project is sort of like bizarre, and you can't.
Yeah, I think we often see in these arguments, and we'll move on to the next one in a second.
Yeah.
It's like, well, atheists can't ground this, but God, God can. Like it's a sort of magic wand. We're going to go on to morality next, and we'll see. I think it's exactly the same picture.
Yeah.
But
Yes.
let's go on to morality
Sure.
clip.
Second, we make claims with regard to morality. But what is morality without a baseline assumption that human beings have inherent worth? Even utilitarian philosophies, the attempt to ignore moral right and wrong in favor of consequentialist outcomes, the greatest good for the greatest number, for example, has to assume something about what makes an outcome good or bad.
The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few.
You can't determine the greatest good for the greatest number without determining the greatest good. And that has moral premises that have to be assumed. The belief in any moral oughts require us to believe unprovable truths that must descend from outside ourselves.
So obviously we've tackled the moral argument before, but maybe not everyone's seen that episode. So Dan, why don't you kick us off with your thoughts on Shapiro's treatment of it?
So there's more going on here than just like the usual badness of the moral argument, right? So people don't know the moral argument is this argument according to which, there are objective moral truths, and if there weren't, if God didn't exist, then there wouldn't be objective moral truths. So God must exist, right? That's the argument. And then Shapiro wants to say that because we all somehow know that there are these truths about morality, we should all believe that there is a God that somehow underwrites or grounds those moral truths. Well, there's more going on here than just that, and I say that because Shapiro was confused about what his argument is even supposed to be. So on the one hand, he starts off the video by saying that utilitarianism is a view that I wrote down what exactly he said. He said that utilitarian philosophy is the attempt to ignore what's right or wrong in favor of consequentialist outcomes. And then later in the video, he wants to say that utilitarians presuppose that there are things that are good or bad, and then don't give you an explanation for how there could be such things, which he thinks you can give in terms of God. So which is it? Does utilitarianism ignore whether there are things that are right or wrong or good or bad, or does utilitarianism presuppose that there are things that are good or bad? Now, of course, the anyone who has taken any introductory philosophy class that covers utilitarianism knows that what utilitarianism actually is it's a theory about which sorts of actions are right or wrong, right? Those actions that are right are the ones that bring about greater happiness or utility, and those ones that are wrong are those ones which bring about greater suffering, you could say disutility. And in fact, John Stuart Mill, who is one of the people who originated the theory, has an account of why it is that there are why it is that happiness, or he would say pleasure, is good. He said it was because if you understand what pleasure is, then you understand that the pleasure is the sort of thing that is intrinsically worth wanting, intrinsically desirable in and of itself and for its own sake. And that suffering, part of what it means to be in pain, for example, is that you're in a state that is in and of itself the kind of state that is that you don't want, just virtue of what it is, and that you don't need something further, the claim would be, to ground the goodness or badness of either of those two things. Now, there's a further debate that happens after Mill's time. There's a further distinction the philosophers would not draw between normative ethical theory and meta-ethical theory. So normative ethical theory, you can roughly think about normative ethical theory as being the part of ethics that's concerned with theories about which sorts of actions, for example, are right or wrong. So utilitarianism, as we saw, gives one account of which actions are right and which actions are wrong. Meta-ethics, among other things, is the part of ethics that's concerned with questions about how to metaphysically ground properties like goodness and badness, or if those properties are objectively grounded at all. When Shapiro says that when you go to a normative ethical theory like utilitarianism, you don't find an explanation for why goodness has how it's metaphysically grounded. Well, in some sense, I mean, again, he's making an elementary error. you wouldn't go to a normative ethical theory to ask how moral properties are grounded, at least from a contemporary perspective. You should go to a meta-ethical theory. And then if you go ask a meta-ethicist, how are properties like goodness or badness metaphysically grounded? Well, there's a giant literature. People debate this issue, and there's all kinds of different perspectives people can have. Some people think that that goodness is grounded in the property of goodness itself. Like, for instance, Plato thought that that goodness is grounded in the form of the good. And
I think we should just point out, Plato believed in God, right? He was a theist, but a
polytheist, some kind of theist,
yeah, not like a Christian theist, but
right, that's right.
He believed in some type of God, and but he didn't think it was morality was grounded in that God, as far as I understand.
That's right. And so what's some of the sometimes in these online debates, like presuppositionalists, for example, and other Christian apologists will say that atheists need to steal from the Christian worldview in order to have like objective goodness. Well, in fact, at least if you look at the way the history went, it was Christians that in some sense stole from a pagan worldview. I wouldn't say an atheistic worldview necessarily, right? Because Plato, for example, believed in God. But the idea that there is an entity whose essence is identical to goodness, it's an ancient Christian idea, but it's preceded by Plato's ideas about the form of the good. And what happens at a certain point in Christian history is that later Christian theologians who are reading Plato begin to think of Plato's form of the good as God. But in fact, Plato got there first, right? And the form of the good, at least in Plato's version, is not God. It's not a being with a mind. It's not a being that has a will. It's not a being that created the universe, though it, at least in Plato's conception, has something like causal power because it gives rise to all the other forms. That's a way in which most Platonists today are going to differ from Plato himself, because most Platonists today are going to say that the form of the good, like all of the forms, doesn't have any causal power. But listen, to Plato's view, the form of the good is this kind of it's the ultimate form, the one that gives rise to all the grounds, all of the others. And even some of this language about some of these funny things that theists or theologians will sometimes say about being, that God is not a being among other beings. Well, Plato said that first about the form of the good. And so a lot of the stuff that theologians are going to want to say later on in history are things that people who didn't identify goodness with God were saying before those theologians. And today, atheists can make use of precisely that same view. They can say, well, maybe I don't like Plato's polytheism, but there's certain aspects of Plato's view that I like, and I can have those parts. And those parts are going to give an explanation of why it is that there can be objective rightness and wrongness and goodness and badness and so on and so forth. Now, that's one view among many different views that atheists could have, but it's one that Shapiro doesn't consider here as even an option.
Alex, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, obviously, I agree with all of that, and I think what he meant to say was that utilitarianism, because what the other sort of theory that's normally contrasted with utilitarianism is the deontology, right? So according to broad brushstrokes, difference being that like on utilitarianism or consequentialism, what goes on is you're kind of calculating like for a given action, it might be that the consequences of that action are so good that it's worth doing, even if it seems like, classically, like, sticking a needle in someone's arm, some amount of harm comes from that, but provided there's a vaccine that's like super efficient and they're in danger, blah, 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 then the consequences are worth the distress or something. The deontology would say something like, well, there are these kind of norms or rules or something which you just shouldn't break under any circumstances. So here you've got your classic example of like you're sheltering Jewish people who are fleeing the Nazis or whatever, and the Nazis knock at your door and say, are you hiding any Jews in here or something? And then it always just like, well, the consequentialist is going to say lie, obviously lie, right? We're going to protect these people's lives or whatever, and the deontologist has to sort of maintain this strange position where it's like you should really never break something. It's like in Kant's words, like a categorical imperative or whatever, well, I suppose the categorical imperative is slightly different, but if it's a categorical norm, then it's just something that's just holds, you have this obligation regardless of the consequences or the context or something. And I think Shapiro is trying to say something like, well, utilitarianism doesn't have these unshakable obligations that where no amount of calculating the consequences helps you. And that's somehow escaping something you don't want. I mean, it's kind of got this like moralizing tone, like we're desperately like just picking any theory, anything I can get, in order to not have these like troublesome like Christian responsibilities or something, so I can live in sin. It's all this
Jewish
narrative
responsibilities.
or Jewish responsibilities, right? Let's say
So
Judeo-Christian responsibilities.
Right. Here's something that's might be helpful for the audience in understanding the difference between utilitarianism and deontology. So, in one of my courses, actually, in a few of my courses that I've taught, there's an article that I use that tries to determine whether Batman is a utilitarian or deontologist. And the issue for Batman is like, why doesn't Batman ever kill the Joker? Now, I'm told by some people that in fact there's some comic book or other where he does in fact kill the Joker. But setting that aside, like you have this problem where like Batman lets the supervillain just like keep hanging around. He putting him off in Arkham Asylum or wherever, and he keeps coming out and like causing a big problem. So what's up with that? And the idea that the author has is that, well, if Batman were a utilitarian, then what Batman would say is, well, it brings about a great deal of suffering for the Joker to be left alive. So the utilitarian says you ought to kill the Joker. The deontologist says, no, this absolute moral rule, you can never take someone's life, no matter what. And so Batman is a kind of deontologist, you might think, because he has these unshakable moral rules that he can never violate. One of those being that he can never kill someone, and that's why he never kills the Joker.
Yeah.
But we should point out there's also rule-based utilitarianism, which is like, let's have the rules that give the most utility rather than the action.
That's right. Yeah. There's tons of different versions of utilitarianism. It's just a big umbrella that has like hundreds of different varieties underneath it. It's not a theory, it's a type of theory.
Well, and you might even point out that like even in the most basic version of utilitarianism, there is one rule that you always apply. The one rule is that you like of all the things that you can do, right, you should maximize utility. You should do the thing that brings about the greatest happiness. And so that for the utilitarian is an unshakable moral rule.
And anyway, the point is here, like, neither of those two is theist or atheist, right? There's not a question, and you often hear people giving responses to the problem of evil, which are along consequentialist lines. It's okay because God had a really good plan in mind, so it's worth the Holocaust or whatever, because the goal that we're going to get to is going to be so good. Or in your own personal life, the horrors and suffering you go through will be rewarded so much by being in heaven afterwards, being close to God and blah, 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 the beatific vision or whatever it is, that it would be worth it. It sort of swamps the bad thing. And that's just a utilitarian calculus. It's just saying the good outweighs the bad, so that's why it's fine. If you have any deontological leanings, you might think Holocausts just shouldn't happen under any circumstances, even if it brings about this big cosmic kind of party or whatever the hell we're supposed to expect happens at the end. It's just, nothing is worth, that type of suffering, you might think. And if you don't, it really does put a strain on, because most people will feel the intuition in both directions. Sometimes the calculation of the greatest good feels right, and sometimes the kind of, this thing should never happen feels right. And it's hard to just sort of disassociate from both of them. But unless, that type of calculation, which is used in the problem of evil to defeat or whatever it is, the horrors that you might find, it's just a really radical utilitarian idea. It's like it's having 0% deontology and 100% utilitarianism. Right? It's a crazy, extreme idea, but it's a Christian idea. It's a theistic idea. It's a response to the problem of evil. It's not just atheists who are utilitarians, right? It's just the deceit that's going on.
It's worth pointing out that historically many, so for instance, the most famous deontologist, Immanuel Kant, was a Christian, a Lutheran, I believe, and it's also true that many utilitarians have been one kind of theist or another. So Mill, for instance, he wasn't a traditional theist, but he was a kind of theist, And I'm told that I've been told that many of the people other than Mill that were promoting various versions of utilitarianism in the 19th century were theists, and they had the idea that God had commanded people to promote utility, that this benevolent deity loves us, and that's why he wants us to promote happiness for others.
And just one last thing whilst we're doing this, he says basically towards the end of the clip there, if I remember rightly, something about how that you need these additional something or other that comes from outside the system or something, these unprovable premises, I think is the way he describes it, right? I think what he's trying to say is that, like, I mean, I'm not completely...
I've got it, hang on, it's, I've got the quote here. It's the belief in any moral oughts require us to believe unprovable truths that must descend from outside of ourselves.
Yeah, okay. I mean, so in one sense, you just read that in one way, and what it's saying is that, like, that somehow, I didn't really explain why this is, but that morality has to be objective. It can't just all be based on what you feel or something. Fine, loads of atheists would agree with that much. I suppose I had this other idea, which was that, like, I think now I've forgotten the idea because I've just pushed it out by saying that last thing I was thinking. God damn it.
Well, I'll just quickly just jump in and say there are, examples like moral Platonism, for example, says that, yes, morality comes from outside of ourselves, but that doesn't mean it comes from God. It just doesn't follow.
Right.
Yeah, and I think that you could just say, sure, it's not all in my head, but what's the picture on theism? Like, it's on theism, I guess isn't it true that you bake in some kind of values? They're not a priori deducible simply from the proposition that God exists. I mean, at some point we have to say something like charity is good and miserliness is bad or something. And, like, I think those at some level have to be put in by hand on anyone's theory. I mean, like, they're not complete. I mean, you might think that they're self-evident or something, in which case, fine. That's a completely neutral idea between atheism and theism as well. But, like, it's just not clear how there's any real difference between the two pictures. He's just, like, sort of shouting about an issue, and we're having to work quite hard to see what the issue is supposed to be. But I think when we do sort of find a nearby philosophical idea that he might be trying to say, it just seems like it's one that's completely independent of the question of whether God exists. It's just like, yeah, okay, maybe subjectivism about ethics, you don't like that. I'm kind of sympathetic to that. I don't really like subjectivism in ethics either. Doesn't mean anything about whether God exists. I mean, it's just a critique about a completely different area of philosophy. So I think he just doesn't get that. Again, we're going back to this idea that he just thinks all you have to do is shit on the cliche of the reductive physicalist atheist.
Mm-hmm.
That's all you have to do. And they do have something they need to tell you about how ethics works. I always find this sort of ethical naturalism where you say something like values like good and bad can be sort of somehow cashed out in non-value laden naturalistic terms. I always find those to be quite difficult to buy into. Traditionally speaking, according to G. Moore, the divine command theory counts as a version of naturalism as well, because it's just to say something like the term, X is good, is reducible to some other paraphrase, like X
Alex,
is
let me
willed
just
by
interrupt.
God or something. Sure.
Because when you said naturalism, I'm not sure everyone will understand the distinction between naturalism in ethics and naturalism as in, like, opposed to theism.
So when I first used
that term,
when I first used it, I meant it basically to be sort of overlapping. So you get these, like, let's say sort of scientific attempts at grounding what morality is, and that might be in terms of things about, like, how shared values in society make for more productive, reproductive environments, or blah blah blah, whatever, some story like that, where ultimately you're talking about things that are more tangible and saying that this is what really morality actually is. And here, so it's naturalism in the metaethical sense, because we're saying X is good if and only if, and there is some paraphrase which is equivalent to saying that X is good, which is just to say you can reduce talk about good to talk about something else. And now and then, but in this case, I'm also saying that the thing we're reducing it to is naturalistic in that more normal sort of non-supernatural way. This is just a mundane, maybe physical, but something like that, sort of non-supernatural thing.
Yeah. So to back up for a moment, you might put it this way. You might say, like one naturalistic view in G more sense is that X is good means X promotes happiness. Right? Like John Stuart Mill might have had a view like that. And then the as you're saying, like the theist has a view according to which maybe the view is like X is good means X is commanded by God.
Yeah.
Right. And like logically speaking, those two analyses have the same structure.
That's right. And Moore has arguments against that type of thing. He doesn't like any attempt to reduce talk of the good to something else. He thinks that the good, a bit like Plato, is this kind of irreducible, fundamental thing, and you can't describe it in fully in terms. You can't cash it out and paraphrase it in any other terms, whether it's to do with God or whether it's to do with the kind of material universe or something. It's just an independent type of thing. So I think, again, all of these distinctions, whether you think the morality that the good is reducible to some other talk or not, completely independent of whether or not you think that God exists. And there are just theists and atheists on both sides of this discussion. So just sort of like complaining about morality, that's hard to explain. I must mean God exists. I mean, I know that's not a charitable reconstruction of what he was saying. It's not far away, really. Honestly, it's not that far away from what he was saying.
And I think it's going to come up in the next one, because the next topic we're going to look at is free will. And sure enough, there are atheists who believe in free will, and there are theists that don't believe in free will. And it's a very interesting debate, but I just have no idea what the hell it's supposed to have to do with God. But let's see if Ben can justify it.
Third, we live as though we believe in choice, as though we are capable of making decisions in some way based on our own will. What in materialism would allow for such choice? How would such choice come about? If we're just balls of meat wandering around in space, how exactly do we make choices? God is necessary for these thoughts, or at least the possibility of God. Trash God altogether, and you can't explain why you would believe in objective truth or morality or even your own ability to choose.
This, of course, Einstein hated because he said God doesn't play dice with the universe. Einstein was wrong. God does play dice.
So I was really confused by the addition of the Kaku, Michio Kaku there. And like, what is the relevance here? Like, if you think that on materialism, everything's deterministic and therefore free will cannot exist, then that quote doesn't seem to help you. Now you could argue that, quantum indeterminacy isn't going to give you free will, that's just independent question. If it's independent, if you make that argument, then it seems to me the quote is irrelevant.
Right. I mean,
if you make the argument that it's determinism prevents free will and materialism is deterministic, then you're contradicting it. So in no way could it help you. I was really curious as to why that was added there.
It reminds me of what some apologists have done with like Penrose's stuff, right? So Penrose has these illustrations in various places, like in The Road to Reality, of God like reaching into phase space and poking the exact location of the universe, and it's all metaphorical. Like Penrose is not a theist, right? And he's not. He
literally said, when I discussed it with him, he goes, "That was a joke."
Yeah, right. I mean, it's like the point is supposed to be about like how small of a region of phase space he's talking about. It's not supposed to be about. It's not a theological argument. And so, and likewise, like here, like Einstein was talking about God metaphorically. I don't know what Michio Kaku's views about God are, but he's not a figure that's like known for promoting his views about God one way or another. And as you're pointing out, there's something very strange here, right? So like on one hand, you might not believe in free will if you think the universe is deterministic. And then if you side with Einstein in these debates about quantum mechanics, you end up thinking that because you think the universe is deterministic, that would be a reason maybe not to believe in free will. On the other hand, if you reject Einstein's views about quantum mechanics and think that the universe is indeterministic, maybe because you side with Bohr, then you think that there are completely naturalistic processes wherein the universe is indeterministic. And if that's what you think is required for free will, like Robert Kane has a view like this, then it seems like you're going to get an account of free will in which you have free will, even though you do have a completely naturalistic world. Like I don't. As you're saying, it seems Go ahead, Alex.
Isn't this Davidson's argument about how free will is incompatible with determinism and indeterminism? Right? Neither of them works. Right? And the basic idea is just, on determinism, free will is incompatible with that because free will presupposes like being able to pick between two options or whatever, and determinism means only one of those two options is really going to happen. You can't really pick the other one. It's easy. Everyone can see the contrast there. And then you think, it must be indeterminism then. But all that means is that there are some events where there's, say, two outcomes, and it's just a probability which way it goes. How does that help you making choices? I mean, if I just say my brain is just sort of randomly, atoms decaying, and that means I pick tea instead of coffee or something, that's not free either. It doesn't matter whether the physics is deterministic or indeterministic. If the beliefs are just being a shit, like the thought is just like what needs to be explained is how your beliefs are a consequence of basically physical processes that are taking place. And if there's some additional special source that comes into the picture, how does that work in with what we know about how a physical process? Because you can give a more or less, I guess I certainly can't. I think physics can't give a completely comprehensive picture of this, but you can tell a story about things bumping into each other and my arm moving, and there's physical story about what happens. It basically completely describes, say, this conversation right now about like the air waves bouncing out of my mouth and hitting the microphone, and neural signals going into my brain and blah blah blah, all of that stuff. And then the thought is just like, what point does free will like kick in, right? Like I should be able to like look at that on a microscope and see something happening as a consequence of my free will. But it's not even clear how these two pictures are supposed to mesh together. So to me, that's the problem of free will. How do we understand that in the scientific picture that we've built up so far?
Here's a picture that you might have. So there's this classic thought experiment that goes way back to the Middle Ages that Buridan gave us about free will. So it says that Buridan imagines a donkey who's equidistant from two bales of hay, and the donkey we're supposed to imagine has equal reason to go to one bale as the donkey has to go to the other. And then we're supposed to have this intuition that the donkey won't simply starve to death. The donkey will choose one over the other, even though the donkey has equal reason to go to either of them, right? Because, in cases where you have more reason to take up one option than another, the determinist is fine with those, right? It could be your reasons, for instance, that determine you to pick one as opposed to the other. That's completely consistent with determinism. But this donkey situation, if it's true the donkey can choose even when the donkey has equal reason for the other side, that's supposed to be incompatible with what the determinist wants to say. Now, you might have the following kind of idea. You might think, well, if you're a naturalist, then you have a bunch of different parts of the brain, and they're all sort of jostling for to be the kind of ruler over the whole brain, and whatever decision you make, it's going to be the part of the brain that wins out, right? So you might have like one part of the brain that is responsible to some reasons, another part of the bunch of other neurons that are responsible for some other reasons, and they're jostling back and forth. And then now if you have equal reason on both sides, and if determinism is true, then neither side is going to win. If you think that physics is on some level indeterministic, if it's just a little tiny bit of indeterminism, then you might suppose that even though nothing determines one brain part to win out over the other, one does in fact win out over the other, and then you get that the agent is doing something. Then
it's just random though, which one, right?
Yeah, right. Well, also, in a way, it's so you might worry about randomness because you might think that if someone does something randomly, then they're not responsible for having done it. They are still responsible in the sense that the reasons that they are being responsive to are reasons that they possess, right? They're responding to one set of reasons over another, even though neither of them rationally wins out.
So it makes sense to assign blame, but it's not clear how the agent is controlling the choice that they made. Because
I want to ask you a question then, Alex, and to you, Dan, as well, because I've often heard this argument that, well, okay, if it's determined, you're not deciding, right? But if it's indetermined, you're not deciding either. These random things in your brain, that's okay. That's not deciding either, right? That's the Davidson argument.
Yeah.
The question I want to ask to that argument is, what's you here? Because aren't you assuming there's an independent you that's completely different to this random stuff that's happening in your brain. But if I'm thinking, no, that is what I am, right, then it's not independent of me. That is me making a choice, because
Right.
what is the other
That's
you
right.
that's supposed to exist there?
So the person who has the kind of the view about free will that I was just offering, someone like, by the way, this isn't my own view, right? This is a view in the literature. It's more or less the view that Robert Cain gives, and the on his view, both of those brain parts are a part of you, right? There's no like independent soul stuff over and above those brain parts. You just are, in some sense, your brain. And the reason why you're supposed to have responsibility in this case is because you're responding to reasons that you possess. They're your reasons. That's why you have responsibility. Now, the thing that's really crucial, I think, here about that view is that on one hand, it might make sense if it's right. It might make sense of some intuitions you could have about like cases where you do something sort of spontaneously and it like feels to you like it's spontaneous. It might make sense of those kinds of experiences, maybe, but at the same time, the kind of responsibility discussed is not a kind of responsibility that's not available to the determinist too, right? Because on the determinist picture, the person is always responding to the reasons that they possess. It's just that they're never in a situation in which something is so carefully balanced to both sides that something random has to break the tie between the two. So in that case, if that's the version of free will that's under discussion, then both the determinist and the libertarian have moral responsibility of some sort in the picture. Now, maybe there are some other arguments, like the ones that Alex is talking about.
So hang on, just to clarify, when you say libertarian, we're not meaning political libertarian.
That's right. Yeah.
Right.
So libertarians in the free will literature think that free will is about the ability to do otherwise, right? That you do something that you're not determined to do, and yet you're still morally responsible for the thing that you're doing. Whereas the compatibilist thinks that determinism and free will are compatible, and many compatibilists think that they're not only compatible, but that in fact we have free will. And the thing to note about those two positions is that the only case in which they differ is a case in which something is so carefully balanced that you have just as much reason to either side, so you need something indeterministic to break the tie. In that case, either it's going to be true that both the determinist and the libertarian have a conception of moral responsibility that they can appeal to, or it's the case that neither of them do. But what it seems to me is that there's no case where one has an account of moral responsibility that's not available to the other. And what that then tells me is that libertarian free will rather, is not required for having moral responsibility.
Let's just bring this back to Shapiro's argument, though. Obviously, he's saying, without God, no free will. I mean, how do we get free will with God? What's the argument supposed to be here?
Yeah, that's super unclear, isn't it? I think so. There's a nearby argument that C.S. Lewis gives, right? The argument from reason, it's sometimes called, where the thought is that, like, unless something like this anyway, unless you can freely choose to believe A rather than B, say, then the what led up to you, unless it's a free deliberative process, basically, in which the agent can sort of pick freely between two options. All that happens is it's just a consequence of some computation that happens before it or something. It's caused by your prior mental state. And he thinks that he thinks there's basically two senses of because, right? Like, I believe that Dan is clever because the previous experiences that I've had or something like kind of made me well, no, actually, I suppose that's not right. I suppose that would be more like the reason-based version of because. Right? I believe Dan's clever because all these clever things he said in the past. There's another sense of because. I believe that Dan's clever because a bunch of neurons are firing in my brain in the right way. And the difference between those two is that it's supposed to be in the first case, the kind of logical because or something reasons-based because is the one that free will is operating on, right? And the causal because, where something just budges into something and then it moves. That those two are incompatible. So whenever you got something where like you have one, you can't have the other. I mean, that already just sounds completely implausible because I just gave an example where the same example has both. But he thinks that like if your brain states are causing you to come to the beliefs that you have, then because they're causing you, it couldn't also be that you're kind of going through this reason, freely picking between the reasons thing. And basically he means that the idea is supposed to be that you're not really rational at all. You're not really engaging in the key ingredient in rationality that you don't have for the determinist is this kind of free ability to pick between the options. You're just left with being a kind of machine that just has beliefs like a computer or something. It just is in a state where something is true or something instead of, and I guess something like that is maybe what Shapiro's going for here. But even then, I'm not sure why it's an argument for God. Is the idea that like
so
can only
I
have
want to
a
make a suggestion.
God exists?
So I think
Go on, Dan.
I think part of what's going on in the background here is again the same issue we raised before, that there's this way of popularly conceiving of these debates as a bunch of like uber reductive materialists on the one hand, and then a bunch of theists on the other hand. Of course, philosophers would want to say that there's plenty of other positions you could take up. I, in fact, would want to say that even if you are an uber reductive materialist, I don't see why free will is supposed to be a problem for you. But even supposing that it is, like, it just doesn't, as you're pointing out, doesn't get you to God, because there's a bunch of other positions available on the table. One of the other things I want to point out is that we've been discussing a bunch of really interesting philosophical issues in response to the clip we watched. We're doing this thing that philosophers very naturally do, where we like sort of grab onto some things that are philosophically interesting to us, and then say, "Oh, look at these other issues." That's not really what was discussed in the clip, but they're things that we find are really fun and interesting to talk about. So we're gonna like run off and talk about those. I think what's a big part of what's going on when Shapiro says these things is that you think about, like, who is his audience and why is he motivated to say these things to the audience that he's speaking to? He's doing this, I think, because he lives in a context where there's this, for a very long time, this goes very deep in American history, for example, there's this conception that if you leave behind traditional religion, then all that's left for you is subjectivism and nihilism and this like mechanical view about human beings that's supposed to be super depressing and all of this other stuff. And you can look way back and find people talking, like C.S. Lewis is actually a great example of someone who in various places talked about precisely that kind of issue. I think in C.S. Lewis's case, one of the reasons he's talking about it, that not a lot of Christians who read Lewis now know about, is that Lewis was he was hanging out at Oxford and Cambridge at a time when the folks like G. Moore had just recently passed out of popularity, and where ethical non-cognitivism were becoming all the rage. And then in that environment,
just explain. Not everyone will know what that.
Yeah,
that
right, sure. So ethical non-cognitivism is this view according to which moral statements, even though they might look like claims about the world, claims that could be true or false, right? That you might want to say murder is wrong. That sounds like a statement that could be true, just like the door is open can be a true statement. The ethical non-cognitivists want to say no, that's the wrong analysis of that language. A statement like murder is wrong, what you're really doing is you're making the kinds of noises people make when they try to discourage certain kinds of behavior. So here's another example when someone might do that. So if you're at a sporting event and you boo for the team that you don't like or something, then that booing sound that you're making, maybe it's discouraging some behavior, but it's not making a claim about the world. And likewise, when you cheer for certain kinds of behavior, that's supposed to be a noise that you make, but without making a claim about the world. You might think that this is also true about like when dogs bark, for example. Like barking is a noise that a dog is making in some sense to communicate, but it's not in the way that like a declarative sentence communicates. It's not capable of being true or false. The philosophical terminology for that is that it's not truth apt. And so in the context that you have to remember that Lewis was connected with the philosophy department at say Oxford, and so he was around the circles where at one point in time G. Moore would have been discussed only a few years before, and then ethical non-cognitivism comes into the fore, and that's the big thing, right? So in the context that Lewis is living in, you have two positions that Lewis thinks are going to be like really popular contenders. Either on the one hand, you have a traditional theological conception, or on the other hand, you have ethical non-cognitivism, right? You have this thing that looks almost like subjectivism. And if the choice is between those two, Lewis thinks that you're really going to be losing something if you give up the traditional theological conception. The other thing to be said about this history is that when people moved to ethical non-cognitivism, they did so in part because the kinds of thought experiments people were giving for something like G.E. Moore's view, a view according to which there are these objective moral properties. People thought that the thought experiments were given in favor of that view actually were thought experiments that much more strongly supported ethical non-cognitivism. They would say, well, what happens when you look at murder? Like, what's your inner intuition? Or what is your experience when you see that state of affairs or a murder takes place? They would say that like your feeling of disapprobation, that's what Moore would say, that's what tells you that it's ethically wrong. Well, the non-cognitive said, no, actually, what you're doing is you're emoting. You're expressing the emotional reaction that you experience when you see that state of affairs. Lewis sees that exchange and says, no, actually, even though that's the direction you might have been led in, is to ethical non-cognitivism, I have this alternative that we're going to need to keep around if we want to recognize the kind of value that he thinks we actually all can internally recognize, right? And so, but ethics today is in a very different place than it was during, say, the 1930s and 40s. So today, there are tons of ethical realists, moral realists running around who are not theists. These are people who think that there are objective truths about morality, who have views that they think overcome the issues with Moore's view and that respond to the objections made by the non-cognitivists. And there are powerful reasons, like there's some, we don't have to get into it, but there's something called the Frege-Geach problem that has led most philosophers to give up ethical non-cognitivism. Mm-hmm. So,
yeah. Oh, go on. Sorry, go on.
Well, I was going to say this is that like what's happened is a weird situation where like evangelical Christians continue to read Lewis, and he continues to have all this cultural currency for them, but they're not reading the meta-ethical literature. So they're reading this person who's like transposed out of time, and so they don't see like what has happened in the world of ethics since the period in which Lewis was working, and in which someone might have felt that there was something maybe compelling. I mean, I don't know if there even was compelling back then, but if there was anything compelling about it, it certainly wouldn't be compelling from a philosophical standpoint today.
And of course, Ben Shapiro is not Christian, but he is living in that world, in the Christian right, and they're influenced by these evangelical writers. And C.S. Lewis is
that's right. And you could imagine a Jewish author who responds the way that Lewis does, right? Who's right. Like sees the same interactions that Lewis is responding to, and then instead of introducing Christian theology as the answer, introduces Jewish theology as the answer. And what I would
and we should say the same is true in the free will debate, right? So if you look at the Field Papers survey, the majority of philosophers are atheists, and they also believe in free will.
Right.
So it just misses this point that there's a very interesting not everyone believes in free will, right? There's a really interesting debate about what is free will, how can we believe in it if determinism is true? So there's this compatibilist school that says, yes, we can believe in free will and determinism. And, some people would say, no, we can't. These are fascinating debates to have.
I think
But
it's
what have they got
also
to do with God?
that's right.
They're just.
I think it also is. So I was talking a moment, how this history relates to what happened with Lewis. There's also there's a few other anxieties that he's responding to here, right? So there's this kind of general cultural anxiety about what happens to children and what are the teachers teaching them and so on and so forth. And those anxieties are also deeply rooted in, for example, American society, and all equally go back very William Jennings Bryan in the early parts of the 20th century, in the late 19th century, was talking about precisely those same anxieties. And it happens to be the case that that young adults, people in the transition between their teenage years and their young adulthood, are precisely the point in the development of their thinking about morality when relativism and subjectivism become really intuitively compelling. And so if you talk to college students, like, how do they feel about ethics? I mean, I've done this, right? Because if you teach like a class on like talks about ethics, and you run into these conversations where you say, okay, well, a bunch of philosophers think that ethics is objective, and then all the students in the room that are not like evangelical Christians are shocked by this. And it's because, like, of course ethics is subjective, right? But the evangelicals are responding to the same kind of like crisis of modernity that the evangelicals want to say, and other conservatives, I guess conservative Jews as well, want to say that the reason why people are in this place when they're, say, 19 is not because of their development as a human being, but rather because, like, our society has fallen away from God, and therefore has fallen away from absolute truth, and away from objective morality, and away from free will, and away from all this other stuff, right? So it's this general anxiety about what's happening to society that I think he's responding to.
Alex, last thoughts.
The funny thing is, when you put it like that, my first thought is that, like, yeah, sure, of course, that's the response to the crisis of modernity really does like play a lot into. I mean, the one key aspect of modernity is a Darwinian theory of evolution, right? And we can see that echoing through Ben Shapiro's words here, when he's constantly like, oh, but evolutionary psychology, blah blah blah. It's just the new way of saying Darwinian evolution, right? It's just the same sort of bogeyman. But if that's the idea, it's completely plausible. It's funny because if you go back and read actual, like, the people who the real cultural Marxists, right? The people like Adorno and what's the other guy? Horkheimer, is that what he's called? Anyway, whatever. The actual cultural Marxists, who were people who came out of Germany and moved across to America in like the 50s, and then they were like seeing around them the kind of McDonald's and drive-through kind of like trashy American 50s culture, basically. Kind of like first series of Mad Men, where it's all, like horrible culture. And they were like, this is shit in many ways. Okay, everyone's got like a house, and there's money here and stuff, but like it's culturally degrading, right? Like all this stuff going on is having negative impacts on people. They didn't like modernity either. The cultural Marxists, quite similar in their outlook. They also critique.
I think it's really important to point out that they would not have called themselves cultural Marxists, right? Like, that's a label that that's like conservatives foist on them.
Yeah.
But they certainly wouldn't call themselves postmodern neo-Marxists, because that phrase is contradictory, right? Like, there's never been a postmodern neo-Marxist. Like, that's not a position that you can take. But certainly there are the people who are accused of having that position, and they would say, they would say exactly what you're saying. And I think even more so than that, there's a strange way in which they have many of the same concerns as someone like Shapiro has. They don't think the solutions are the same, but they're concerned about the slide of society, and
Yeah.
concerned about like the invisible forces that move society and
Yeah,
let
nobody
me
owns
just
that
steer,
worry. So anyone can have that worry. Sorry, Phil.
let me just steer the conversation a little bit back to
Yeah,
the
yeah.
free will thing, right? Because we've
yes.
gone quite off topic. So I want to do that. I guess Shapiro's thought and the theistic thought is, well, you know, if we're just a brain, then there's no free will. But if we have a soul, then there's room for free will. I mean, do you think that's what he's trying to say?
Yeah.
What do we think about
Basically, that's about the short of it. Because it's just, like we've said before, it's this fallacy of pinning the atheist into determinism, reductive materialism, blah, 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 blah. So on the other side of that, the theist is a dualist, basically. So they just say, look, the mind can pick freely because it's not a physical thing. It's not like constrained like a physical object would be by the prior causal history up to that point or something. It can just go in a different direction if it feels like it. You know, that doesn't really explain anything because I still think the classic interaction problem remains. Like, how come then, if this is so divorced from all the causal orders, do anything? If it can't be pushed around by atoms, how can it push atoms around? Right? I'm not saying that's completely insurmountable, but it's a big issue. But also, it's just completely irrelevant about whether theism is true, because you could just be an atheist and think that dualism is true. It doesn't mean it has to. I mean, you can be an atheist, think that the mind is independent of the body, and that the mind continues to exist after death if you want to.
That's
I mean,
well, you know what's ironic is that in this, I don't think we've gotten to the clip yet, but there's a clip where Shapiro himself plays a clip of David Chalmers, who is famous for being both an atheist and a dualist. So,
right.
yeah, exactly. But I think it does relate to the stuff about like his anxieties about what's happening to society, right? Like even this issue does, because it's about the giving up of traditional values, right? There's this concern here where, like, if you give up the idea that human beings have some like intrinsic non-material worth and value, then like you make us into these like mere automatons, and then you don't have, you give up value, and then it's okay to, like, I don't know, kill all of us or something.
I mean, it's super interesting. We're going off in a different direction, but I kind of want to say, like, what's the payoff there? You have to say something like, if there are good arguments for something, if there's evidence in favor of something, you can't just say, well, if we believed that, society would collapse. I mean, if it's
he's
true,
not saying
it's
that,
fucking true,
right?
But,
so he's not giving voice directly to the anxieties. But what I think what's going on is he's speaking to an audience who is already responsive to those anxieties. So as he's giving these arguments, it's like worrying them that, oh, this is like this is where atheism leads you, and see how horrible it is. So we can't go there.
Right, but it's just an appeal to consequences, because, like I'm saying, like, suppose it's true that science tells us some truth that threatens the foundation of our society or something. I mean, like, the thing is, what do you do with that then? Do you just try and not tell everyone the thing that you found out so that we don't? I mean, because sooner or later it's going to come out, isn't it? So, like, really, what the bold thing to do is to just sort of try and live in the truth, even if it's bad for society.
I mean, to be charitable to Ben Shapiro, I think his view is free will does exist. And in fact, he says we act as if it exists. Like he said, in his debate with Alex O'Connor, you couldn't live without sort of acting as if free will exists.
Yeah. Right.
And I found that a weird argument, because I'm like, well, don't you act as if there's no life after death? Don't you cry when someone dies? Like you don't act like it's no big deal, there's a heaven. So I found that on all. I think his view is, well, free will does exist, and if we're just living in a materialistic universe, then it couldn't exist. So believe in God, and then you can believe in free will, which is clearly true. Like free will exists. I think that's what he's trying to say.
Yeah, I think that's right. That you can say there's some weird hypocrisy about, like, like, if you think that your loved ones have gone to heaven, doesn't make much sense to sort of mourn at the funeral. I think that's right, but I think that cuts both ways, because I also think that almost no atheists, or people who at least take a contrary view about the afterlife, really live that authentically in that. Right? Most people lazily sit and waste a Sunday afternoon not really doing anything, and they're not thinking to themselves, right, if I think there's no afterlife, this is all I've got, I should make absolutely every moment count. Most people don't make every moment count, even if they do think there's no afterlife. So, like, both sides don't live coherently, it seems to me, with the kind of grand metaphysical consequences of their view.
I would also point out that I think we should move on to the next clip soon.
Right.
But I think the other thing to point it out, but at least about the afterlife, is that you cry when someone you love, or, well, I don't know if you always do, but you may cry if someone you love is going to be out of contact for a very long time. Right. So if your spouse goes on a 5-year trip, and you know that during that 5-year trip you're not going to be able to hear from them, that might sadden you. And it could be that people are thinking about the afterlife in those terms, that they will see them again, but they're going to have to live for
okay, but then why the fear of death? Like, the fear of death looms large, right? So if you really believe you're going to heaven, it should be less, shall we say? I mean, maybe you could argue, well, you might be going to hell, but in Judaism, which Ben is a Jew, hell is not really a thing.
But the point is, like, how come they fear death at all, and how come we don't fear death more? And both of those, it's just psychologically easier, basically. That's the answer in both cases.
Yeah. But that was his point about free will. Like, you have to, you couldn't live without believing in free will. So, and hey, you can't have free will without God. But I think the bottom line is you can have free will without God. And also, maybe free will doesn't exist. Obviously, that's another respectable view, right? That's another possibility we have to lay on the table.
Even here, I do want to sort of, like, sorry, I know we want to get on to the next clip.
Yeah, go on.
We've got like 17 more clips or something, but like, just to pause on it for a second. I mean, like, it's a cliche to say this idea that you can't live without the feeling of free will. It obviously goes back before this, but it's a Kantian line that I can't remember off the top of my head, but like, it goes at least back as far as Kant. But I do think it's kind of a bit overdone. I mean, let's just pause to think about, like, just the phenomenology, that is to say, like, what it's like sort of on the inside in your experience of, like, speaking a sentence. Very few sentences, unless you're reading a line, you're an actor, something like that. Do you really know exactly how the sentence is going to end? And yet it does, and it's grammatically well formed most of the time, to some extent at least. What's going on there, right? To some extent, conscious. I mean, I'm kind of choosing the words that I'm saying, but I'm not really taking executive kind of oversight over absolutely all parts of that.
Right.
A lot of it, I'm just sort of like letting it happen, and it just kind of comes out. And or saying, play golf or football or something. Try and analyze and overthink and like completely control each of those actions. You won't be able to do it. You have to kind of just let go and allow the situation to just sort of happen around you. And I think we just have this, like, we overplay the idea that of free will. I mean, it's not completely, these sorts of things, when I start describing that phenomenology, you both nod along because it's completely intuitive, because that's what it's like inside your experience most of the time. So, like, the idea that we can't imagine the world unless we imagine ourselves as a kind of like ultimate free executive control agent behind all of our actions, it's not even true. I mean, I think it would paralyze me. It would make me unable to do anything unless I could just rely on the autopilot kind of function of my brain to do basically most of it for me, right?
I'm really sympathetic to that. And the last thing I'll say about it is that
don't make promises you can't keep.
You could have a very inflationary conception of free will or a very minimal conception of one. My own view on this is that my own view about free will is extraordinarily deflationary. It takes very little to have free will. And that's part of why I'm a compatibilist. And then it's going to turn out that there's no part of the, like, it's going to turn out that, like, my own experience of living is one where I would be completely fine saying that was an experience of someone who was entirely causally determined from the past. And I can't identify an experience for you where it's really clear to me that I'm doing something that I haven't been causally determined to do.
All right, we're gonna put a line under it there, and we're gonna move on to the next clip where Ben gives an actual argument for God's existence.
The argument goes something like this. First, change exists in the world, but all change is the actualization of a potential for that change. So if something is changing, it's because there was a potential for that change in the thing. No potential can be actualized unless something already actual actualizes it. So that means that all change is caused by something already actual. This means either there is an infinite regress of actualizers, or there is a purely actual actualizer. This is sort of like the old joke about the philosopher and the turtle. The philosopher is asked, what supports the earth? And he says, a turtle. And somebody says, well, what supports the turtle? And he says, another turtle. So what about that one? He says, it's turtles all the way down. The infinite regress argument is just not convincing. There has to be something underlying the final turtle. There has to be one prime cause. That cause can't have any potential, because if it had potential, something else could activate it into changing. So there's one unchanging cause that is purely actual. That is the thing that we call God, and it actualizes all of the other changes.
So it's the classic argument from change. Dan,
before we go into the philosophy, can I just point out that Ben Shapiro is such a naturally humorless individual that he tried to tell a joke, but it wasn't remotely funny. It wasn't even clear which part was supposed to be the punchline. He didn't even linger on it, give it any delivery whatsoever. The old joke and then he didn't really say a joke. What a fucking idiot this guy is, right? If it's damage discharge, then if you need a bucket and a mop, then my wife says you should actually go seek a GP's attention. Like, calm down, man. For fuck's sake. Anyway, sorry, carry on.
Yeah.
That's okay.
Well, so Joe Schmidt and I co-authored a book that covers exactly this kind of argument. It's a book called Existential Inertia and Classical Theistic Proofs. If people don't want to pay the exorbitant amount of money that it takes to buy that book, they can you can either email me or Joe, and we can send you a copy. The other
is that what pays for all your luxury holidays, Stan?
Well, we get no money from it. So the book is extraordinarily, it's like $100 or something. I think there's like used copies on Amazon now, but people should know that money goes straight to the publisher, and Joe and I see none of it. So I'd be happy to hook people up with a copy if they want to email me. But the other thing to be said about it is that Joe, and there's a YouTube channel called Rationality Rules, and
oh yeah, we should shout him out, because actually he shouted us out, and so we should do the same. And yeah, go on.
Yeah, so that YouTube channel, they did a video on precisely this argument, and covered it in a lot of depth that we're not going to get to here. There's a few things he pointed out about it. One is that it requires a conception of change that is philosophically controversial. So it requires this kind of Aristotelian conception of change, where change involves the actualization of a potential. And that conception of change is controversial for a variety of reasons. One reason that it's controversial is that it requires a view on which there are two different kinds of existence. There's a kind of potential existence and an actual existence. And most philosophers, at least most analytic philosophers, have had the view that there's only one kind of existence, and that it's what's represented by the existential quantifier. So that already would tell you that, well, they can't accept this account of the Aristotelian account of change. Another thing to be said here is that there are other accounts of change on offer. So, for instance, there's what's called the at theory of change. It's one theory of change. According to the at theory, it just says that like an object or an item or whatever undergoes a change just in case the object or the item or the whatever has a property at one time that it does not have at another time, right? And that's why it's called the at theory, because it uses the word at twice. That view requires less controversial metaphysics than does the Aristotelian account of change. Another thing to be said here is that, so Shapiro said that this thing about infinite regresses, that infinite regress,
it's not convincing. There you go.
So he had this weird thing. He said that the infinite regress argument is not convincing. I don't know what the argument is. It's certainly not an argument that I offer, right? What I would say is this. If I was going to give an argument that involved the idea that there could be an infinite regress, I would say, look, for all I know, there's an infinite regress. And since that's a live possibility that belongs on the table that we haven't ruled out, we can't say that there needs to be a prime cause, right? Well, you only get to say that if you can rule out the regress. No, of course, people have very certain ways in which they try to rule out the regress, but well, for various reasons, I find that those arguments unconvincing. But anyway, those are a few reasons that you might not be convinced by this argument. I'm sure Alex has some things to say as well.
Well, yeah, I want to point out that what he said was actually dumber than what you reconstrued it to be there. I mean, just the words on the page, as it were. He says something like I guess you've got the transcript there, Phil. When he says something about how like it's turtles all the way down, but that's unconvincing. There must be something underneath the first turtle. It's like, you fucking idiot. If it's turtles all the way down, it's not like all the way down and then it stops at some point. It's infinite turtles, you idiot. There's every turtle, there's another turtle underneath it. So there is no first turtle. There's nothing resting unsupported.
Yeah, I've got the text here. It says, he says, somebody says, well, what supports a turtle? And he says, another turtle. And that one says, it's turtles all the way down. The infinite regress argument is just not convincing. There has to be something underlying the final turtle.
Exactly, the final turtle. That's just like not a thing on this hypothesis. Its whole point is it's just a never end or never beginning, whatever you want, sequence of turtles where each one there's another turtle underneath it. So, like, look, the only real argument against the infinite regress of this type is basically given by Aquinas, and it's supposed to be that if you distinguish between accidental and essential causes, right? So chains of causation. So the distinction is supposed to just be like, think of the type of causes that's relevant in this case is like, it's not one thing happening like a billiard ball bumping into another billiard ball that bumps into the 8-ball or something, right? It's more like, because what's happening then is you've got a temporally ordered sequence of causes or changes. Here what we're supposed to have is something like grounding. So it's not about one thing happening and then another thing happening, like in the Kalam or something. It's more like the arm that holds the stick that pushes the stone. So all of there is a grounding relation because the movement of the stone is kind of grounded or determined by the movement of the stick, which in a sense is the same, determined by the movement of the arm. And then he says, look, in the first type of sequence, where it's just one thing happening, say, for instance, the sequence of generations, right? So you have one generation that gives rise to another, like a father, he gives rise to a son, and then in their own turn gives rise to another child or whatever. You can imagine the father stopping existing doesn't mean that the son's going to stop existing, right? That once the causal transmission has sort of been passed from one to the other, it doesn't matter if the first thing is still there anymore. But in this essential chain, then with the hand that's pushing the stick that's pushing the stone, if the hand disappears, the stick just drops on the floor and the stone stops moving straight away. And you like kind of need to keep having, this is the thought, right? And you're supposed to think, okay, so if a chain like that went back forever, it would, there'd be nothing that was imparting the impetus initially or something, right? But it seems to me that the key problem with that is that, like, I can understand how if you had a causal sequence that terminates at, say, a purely actual actualizer or something, and then we just remove the purely actual actualizer, now the ground floor that everything was resting on is gone, and it sort of feels like everything's just going to collapse or whatever, right? I can sort of understand, if there's a train car that's pulling all of, one train car with an engine or whatever, it's pulling all these carriages. If the engine thing just poofs out of existence, it would just slowly grind to a halt because there's nothing pulling it along anymore. Okay, I get that. But the problem is, and this is where they always skip over this bit, because they go like, yeah, and that's why you can't have an infinite regress, because it would be just like a train that doesn't have an engine. But you just think like, well, even if I think that sort of sequence that grounds out in a fundamental layer and then you take the fundamental layer away, then there's a problem there. It's not clear why that is in fact analogous to a case where it's just turtles all the way down, and what we mean is for every turtle there's another turtle underneath it, because that doesn't have the same feature as the train that's lacking the initial train carriage, right? That just sort of goes up to some point and then there are no further train carriages pulling this one forwards, and that's why it's wrong. But in the infinite case, you never find that. So I just think what Ben Shapiro thinks he's doing is pointing to this like settled question or something. But I actually just think that the history of philosophy here has just been a big sort of a big hand wavy, like, and then you kind of see where it's going, right? You get the kind of thing. That's what philosophers have been saying for like 1,000 years or 2,000 years on this question. And actually, no, I don't get it. I spell it out more clearly because I'm not getting the analogy here.
It's also this isn't usually pointed out, but it may be worth pointing out that it's not just the history of philosophy that's this way, right? It's also the history of science, or you might say like scientifically inspired philosophy. So one of the classic issues that came up within the first few decades after Einstein had developed the theory of relativity is that you can't have that the relativity is inconsistent with having a completely rigid rod. And that's because of the fact that you can't have a signal that's transmitted instantaneously from one point to another.
Mm-hmm.
So imagine like a rod that extended from here all the way to the Andromeda galaxy. If a signal could be transmitted instantaneously, then I could like push on one side of the rod, and at the other end it would be moving instantaneously, right? But if signals can only move at the speed of light or less, then that means that when I push on the end of the rod, it has to be some significant time later that the end of it is actually moving. In fact, the signal will get transmitted through the rod not even at the speed of light. It will get transmitted through the rod at the speed of sound in the material the rod is made out of.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when you think about that example from Aquinas, where he's got the arm that's pushing the stick, and that's supposed to be an essentially ordered causal series. Well, it seems like as best as I can tell, what you get out of relativity was that at least in that example, what you would have is not an essentially ordered causal series, but rather an accidentally ordered causal series, but much more like the series of generations, precisely because the signal needs to be transmitted through my arm and then through the material and back again and everything. The other thing to be said is that so there's something that's sort of peculiar about this example with the turtles. Right? We're supposed to imagine a planet that's sitting on top of a bunch of, like the Earth sitting on the back of a bunch of turtles as if it needed something to support it there. And of course, the discovery that all of us know is that there is nothing like that, right? There's nothing that supports Earth in its position. One very popular conception you might get out of say classical physics, Newtonian physics, for example, is that everything in the universe is related to everything else. That it's not that the sun exerts an influence on the Earth that the Earth doesn't exert on the sun. They both exert the same influence on each other, and in fact, they both are orbiting the center of mass of the solar system. It's their mutual interaction that causes them to do what they respectively do, and in fact, it's the mutual interaction of everything in the entire universe to do what it does. That's very different than this regress of causes that someone like Aquinas believed in. And in fact, it's so different that for someone like Ernst Mach, it was a good reason to think that there is nothing like efficient causation at all, right? So Mach thinks that in place of efficient causation, what there are these reciprocal interrelationships among all the different parts of the universe that all sort of mutually support each other, and that because all those relationships are reciprocal, we shouldn't think of them after the model of like Aristotelian efficient causes. If that's the right picture, or if anything like that picture is right, then you don't even have like a regress of causes. And another way you might put that is that there are views on the table, not just Mach's, but other views as well, on which causation, even if you have causation, isn't a regress, and that there are philosophers, for instance, who think that causation isn't transitive. But in any case, again, this is like another place where what he's doing is he's smuggling in controversial metaphysics and supposing that everyone can get on board with that same metaphysical picture, when there's a lot more to be discussed about whether we should even discuss any of the aspects of that metaphysical picture in the first place.
Let me just ask about the issue of motivating a theory of change. And my understanding is that, Parmenides thought change was impossible because it would imply something could come from nothing. And then this idea came from Aristotle that you have potential and then actual. And we make these two distinctions, and that can overcome Parmenides' problem. Now, but the modern view, of course, scientifically, is that change is atoms rearranging. Of course, we can go deeper at quantum fields or whatever, but we can just think of it as atoms are being rearranged. So we just think of that. And do we need this language of potential and actual? It seems that's outdated. I mean, outdated because the atomist view is actually before Aristotle.
There's a really great Unbelievable episode which has Arif Ahmed and Ed Fazer discussing this very question, because this argument that Ben Shapiro is giving now just comes from Fazer's book, which is what Dan and Joe were responding to as well. And I think Shapiro interviewed Fazer, and that's probably where this comes from. Is he literally just told him the argument, and that's why he knows about it. But if you listen to this episode of Unbelievable, what's really cool is that Arif Ahmed basically is just like, I don't buy this language of potentiality and actuality. You're going to have to convince me that that's legitimate. Otherwise, I'm just going to describe the world in a much more austere sort of Humean language. And it just undermines the very first part of the argument. You have to, as you said, there are these potentials and actuality and blah, blah, blah. And like, no, that's already metaphysics that is optional, but effectively, and actually quite. Some people like it. There are still, contemporary programs in philosophy that just completely take it for granted and move on from there. Of course, obviously, but it's not compulsory. You don't have to. It's just that, like, the notion of God that you get out of this argument, of the purely actualizer, super difficult to square that with the God in the Hebrew Bible. I mean, I'm surprised that Shapiro's super on board with this, because, like, how can you possibly say that the God who gets annoyed with his creation and decides to smite the people in Sodom and Gomorrah and do the flood and, flies across the waters and blah, 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 how can that personal being that gets angry and whatever, how can that be the same thing as a purely actualizer? Because that means that thing has no potentialities. It's the whole point of the argument, is that this thing has to be different. It has to be lacking in any potentialities. It has to be full and unbridled actuality. But that just means it can't change. It can't change its mind. It can't, say something to you one day that it didn't say the day before, because that would be actualizing a potential to speak. So no communication, no personality, no personal relationship, no changing its mind. Like, none of the things that we see throughout the Old Testament, throughout the New Testament, arguably, either. It's the God of the philosophers. It's not the God of the theologians. Those two things are very different. And nowhere in the Western canon is this more pronounced the difference than in this Aristotelian argument. Right? It's never been fully reconciled with a personal, loving, changeable God. It basically can't be reconciled, if you ask me.
To be fair, there are plenty of people in the Jewish tradition, not in the Bible, mind you, but people like Maimonides who have equally sort of biblically removed conceptions of God, right? Where the kind of negative theology that Maimonides wants to take up is one where there's nothing that you can positively attribute to God, right? So you might more than want to say that, like, oh, God has a will and God is good. And Maimonides would want to tell you that no, you can't literally make those assertions of God. You can't literally make any.
You can say what he isn't, but you can't say what he is.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, you can make negative assertions about God, but you can't positively say what it is that God is. Aquinas. So there's two different. There's the positive way and the negative way. Maimonides is the classic representative of the negative way. The positive way is where you can make definite ascriptions of God. And Aquinas is, at least thinks of himself, and is thought of as by many other people, as making kind of middle path between these. That Aquinas has this doctrine of analogy, according to which it's not true that you can only say what God is not, but at the same time, you can't. Predicates are not going to be said of God in the same way that they are said of creatures. They analogously apply between God and creatures, and so there is a way of being even more further removed from an anthropomorphic conception of God than the picture that Aquinas gives you. You can be Maimonides, but of course, maybe, I mean, I don't know Ben Shapiro thinks about Maimonides, but as a Jewish person, he may well think that Maimonides has authority on theological matters.
All right, let's move on to the next clip. If we're going to go on for another one, let's try it.
Now, atheists frequently suggest that science has killed God. But as we've seen, science itself requires certain presuppositions outside of science. As mathematician Kurt Girdle stated, any internally consistent system of mathematical axioms cannot be completely comprehensive. There must be assumptions made outside the system.
Alex, I got the sense that you weren't entirely happy with the use of Girdle's incompleteness theorem. What was wrong with that?
I mean, there is a cottage industry of people making out of the philosophical significance of Girdle, and there is philosophical significance there. Of course, it's a supremely interesting and unexpected result. It's just that it's like one of these things where, like, if you read Deepak Chopra on quantum mechanics, and it's all about spiritual fucking whatever, and you just know that's not what anyone who actually works in the field thinks. And it's the same here. If you ever hear a Christian apologist talk about Girdle's incompleteness theorem, I once wrote a blog post about inspiring philosophy doing the same thing, where he was making a big deal out of Girdle, blah blah blah, and that means that God exists, and it's just. At its basis, right, what Girdle showed was that mathematical logic, which is a specific thing, it's the logical system that allows you to express the propositions of arithmetic, right? So it's this thing called piano arithmetic. That system, counterintuitively, although it can obviously express all of the propositions of arithmetic, the proof theories that comes with that system can't prove all of those. Can't prove all of the theorems of the system. There are true propositions about which you can't prove it in either direction. So I suppose you can prove all the theorems of the system. That's a really stupid thing to say, but there are true statements that it can't prove, and that no one was seeing that coming. And without getting super technical about it, the point is it's restricted. It says that systems that are more complicated than that, if you add more axioms to mathematical logic, you're still going to find that there's this gap, the incompleteness, right? But it's not that all logical systems are incomplete, because Girdle also can prove the completeness. No, wait, is it Girdle who? Kripke, I guess, who proved the completeness of S5, right? This is a simple completeness proof. So there's another logical system.
People won't know what S5 is.
And in a way, it doesn't really matter. But the point is just that there are other logical systems out there, axiomatic things like Euclidean geometry, where you write down 5 axioms, ways of deducing the other things. You can just say everything else you want to about it. System just like that, but where this property of completeness, you can show that it is there. And there are other mathematical systems, and Girdle showed to the unexpected, nobody expected this to happen, that there are some systems for which you can't say that. And it infects everything above that. So anything you build on mathematical logic is still going to have that there. Now there are sort of semantic things you can do, but it doesn't matter. Now that's interesting because there's loads of things, significant things that you'd want to build on top of mathematical logic. There are loads of things, like computationally interesting things that you'd want to do on top of that. It's just not everything. It's not a universal thing where it says, this is where people get it wrong. They say, like, any system, you have to be able to transcend it. This is a Deepak Chopra kind of like spiritualism thing or whatever. That's not what Girdle's saying, right? It's not that language requires a transcendental mind for it to have meaning or whatever. Like, that's the sort of crap that people say. And here, this was just as irrelevant to the point he was making as when he brought in Michio Kaku to talk about Einstein and blah, blah, blah. It's just a wrong topic. Not even close to being the right thing.
So it's ironic that people do this because Girdle himself had plenty to say about theology, right? Girdle himself had a proof of God's existence he thought worked. But it does nothing to do with the incompleteness theorem. Or at least not in the way that people think. So there's, the picture that one of the pictures they showed was this picture of Einstein and Girdle walking together at the Institute for Advanced Study. I've actually been at the place where that picture was taken, and it's not too far from where Joe Schmidt is at school now, actually. But there's a book by Yorgrau, actually 2 books by Yorgrau on the relationship between Einstein and Girdle, and the more popular level one goes a fair bit into Girdle's theological views. So here's one way that people might think in very simple terms about what it is that Girdle showed. So here's a game that you can play. Imagine that I can write down a sequence of symbols. I have a set of rules for given some collection of sequences. I have a rule that allows me to like write down a new sequence of symbols, and so then given any sequence, I can write down another one. That's something that we call a derivation. Right? That's like starting with a sequence of sentences, and then I've got rules that'll tell me which sentences I can write down after that. And the sentences you write down after that, that's what we call theorems. Those are the sentences that you say could be deduced from the axioms. Now, in any logical system, there are rules about which sentences or which sequences of symbols are legitimate sentences within that language. We call them well-formed formulas. And then given a well-formed formula or like a legitimate sequence of symbols within some language, you can assign a truth value to any one of those sentences. And so, you can imagine like writing down a sentence that says like the house is red, and then within a given logical system, like that sentence might be true or it might be false. And then you're just playing this game where you're just like moving around these sentences, and you have rules for doing that. Now, imagine that there's a sentence that on the one hand you can write down, and that the rules tell you is a legitimate sentence of your language, right? So it's a well-formed formula. In other words, it's formulated the correct way, so it should have a truth value assigned to it. But there's no way to go from the axioms that you're given to that sentence. In that case, there's a sentence that has a truth value, but that you can't prove. That's what the Girdle incompleteness theorem say. And they say that that any logical system that is complex enough to include arithmetic, right, the arithmetic in particular, is going to be one that has that feature, in which there's this game you can play where no matter what move you make in that game, you can never get to all of the sentences that you're allowed to write down. That's it. That's all the incompleteness theorem says.
So I'm trying to imagine what Shapiro's argument really is. And I guess he's trying to say something like, well, we need something else.
Yeah.
We can't do it within the tools that we have through our mathematics and our science and so on. So we need something else. And maybe that something else is God. Do you think that's what he's trying to get at?
Maybe, but there's a few problems if that's going to be the argument. So one is that, so here's something that's always going to be true. Suppose that I've got some system in which there's some system is undecidable. That in other words, there's one of these sentences that, given the axioms I have, I can never reach by any of the legitimate rules that I can follow. Well, I can then build another system in which I include that sentence I can't reach as an axiom, and now it's included in there. In fact, it's trivial to write it to have a proof of it, because the one rule that's typically legitimate rule is that given some sentence you've written down previously, you're allowed to write down that sentence again. You can derive any sentence from itself, and so you can always make your logical system more complex by adding that sentence in. Now, it's going to turn out that since that new logical system you built, that broader one, is also complex enough to contain arithmetic, because we said it was undecidable, that it itself is going to be undecidable. There's going to be some other sentence. But I could again do the same move. I could say, okay, let's build a bigger system in which I include that among the axioms. You can always do that. Here's the other thing that's worth pointing out. God is going to be like this, right? Like, consider all the things that God that God knows. Now, there's 2 possibilities for any one of those things that God knows. Either it's something that he sort of knows axiomatically, or it's one that he derives from the others. Presumably, God's mind is going to be complex enough to contain arithmetic. So I don't understand how this undecidability issue is supposed to be one that you resolve by like resorting to the mind of God. It seems to me that
exactly.
whatever God's mind is like is going to have precisely the same features.
And it's not, yeah, I mean, that's absolutely right. You can just say, like, for every sentence that's either true or false, God knows which way around it is. But how could he possibly know one of these undecidable sentences? He certainly didn't derive it from the axioms using the valid rules of inference or whatever in that system. So how the fuck did he know it? Right? It's not clear how he could possibly. But I think that the other thing I was going to say is floated away again. Fucking hell. Okay. Never mind. No, that'll do. It's enough on that.
I mean, is there a similarity between all these arguments? Like, you basically, in a sense, it's something like a God of the gaps. It's like, well, okay, a gap has appeared because we've got an incompleteness theorem. The gap's here because we can't account for free will, apparently. All right, and a gap's here, so maybe we can't account for morality. And I'm just going to wave my magic God wand and plug all those gaps. And is that, do you think, fair, or am I being a bit too harsh?
So I think it's something like this. I think it's exactly what you're saying. But I think the thing about incompleteness is here's one way to look at it, is that you might think, okay, well, a computer, given some set of axioms and given like a logical system sophisticated enough to include arithmetic, there's going to be some sentences it can't get to by the rules that computers can follow. But humans, we can make these like leaps. And so we can make like an intuitive leap to that extra sentence. And then we could include that we can do something then that like a machine couldn't do. I think that's supposed to be the idea.
There's some philosophical significance of Girdle's theorems. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, and now the thing that has in common with all these other arguments is that it responds to this general anxiety that I was talking about before, that we're going to lose something important about human beings, given what like the modern worldview has told us about who human beings are. And so we need to go way back into the tradition and rescue this important part of, you can imagine Shapiro talking about this, right? We've lost this part of the Western heritage. We have to reclaim it. Like that's the idea, right? And the thing that we've lost, he would say, is the value that we have in virtue of being the special creation of God, and that this is yet another way in which we don't have that value. And then I would just say, well, in fact, you never needed God to have a view in which human beings are valuable in that way, supposing that they are.
I guess I'm not connecting the dots between the two, though. Still, like, okay, so you could say this like idea that Girdle shows you there's a sort of deductive limitation with systems mathematical logic, right? And so you could take some proposition where a computer would be paralyzed, but a human could somehow figure it out. Anyway, it's still not really quite clear about that. They could come to believe it one way or the other, like Buridan's ass. They just
there's no
pick one
story,
of the options,
right?
but,
I mean,
like,
this is part of the objection we would have to that argument, right? Which is that you've told me that a computer can't do this, and a human, I guess, can. How? Like, what? How is it that human beings are able to transcend logic? And it's not even so. It's deeper. The problem is deeper than that, because the Shapiro wants to say that logic is ultimately grounded in God somehow.
Yeah.
Never mind how, because he hasn't told us the story of how that happens. But suppose that that's true. Well, can you transgress God? I mean, can you transcend the abilities that God has endowed us with? If not, then you're not going to get around Girdle's theorem. Right? So like, if there's going to be some way that you can magically skirt around it, never mind how that happens, but imagine that there's some way that you could do that, it would involve transcending what logical systems can do, and therefore transcending the capacities that apparently God has endowed us with.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, it would transcend. It's just really unclear. Like, say there's some. Like, according to Girdle, there is some purely arithmetical, well-formed formula, something along the lines of 5 + 7 = 12 or whatever, right? That isn't provable. And see, it's already really confusing to me because I don't understand how there could be a sentence like that. Because change the numbers if you want, add in more symbols of the nature of plus, minus, subtract, and divide. That's all you get in arithmetic. How could there be a sentence that I can't? Anyway, so I have to put my kind of incredulity about it because I accept the proof, obviously, but like the thing is, Girdle's translating it, so he doesn't actually give you an arithmetical sentence that can't be proven. What he does is codes them all up as prime numbers and then churns through the proof itself is super weird. It's like an alien talking to you. Right? It's completely unlike the sort of thing you'd think yourself, right? If you were left to your own devices. But as far as I know, maybe there are people who've done this, but I'm not sure that there are any like widely known examples of actual arithmetical sentences that can't be proven, right? Like where it's not just a Girdle sentence is true and you can't prove that, but it's of the form of this number plus this number and you can't prove it.
I was pretty sure that there were important mathematical results that have been shown to be independent. So, for instance, isn't that true about haven't people said that's true about like the continuum hypothesis?
Well, I don't know. Is it? I don't know. I genuinely don't know. Is it an example of a currently unproven hypothesis?
Well, I feel like if I say one way or another, I'm going to get it potentially wrong. So I won't say that
tell
right
me
now.
I'm wrong in the YouTube comments. Right? Feel free.
Yeah,
but,
I'm reasonably
we are
sure.
going on something of a tangent as well.
Right, but
I think this is an important point because
let's bring it back to Shapiro's argument.
Here's how it relates to Shapiro's argument, right? So if the argument that he's giving is supposed to be that human beings can do something that like a machine couldn't do, that like human beings could know whether a statement is true or false, even though it can't be derived from some set of axioms, or proved from some set of axioms rather, then where's the proof of concept? Like where is Girdle shows you that there are such statements. He doesn't give you necessarily like a good example of one. He doesn't show you that a person could really do this. So unless we find some example where someone does it, then it doesn't. There's a problem. Now I think what's true is that there are examples of important mathematical statements that mathematicians know about that one in some like meta theory you can prove are independent of their axioms, and if I remember correctly, perhaps I don't, the continuum hypothesis is one of those. But in any case, like if it turned out that there weren't any statements like that, then Shapiro is in trouble. I think actually Shapiro is in trouble even if there are, because the way you would do this is that it's not by like somehow magically intuiting that there's some formula like that, right? What you do is you go to some meta theory. In other words, some theory that's larger in some well-defined sense than the theory that you're talking about. And from the perspective of that theory, you're now able to make statements about that theory that can't be proven within that theory. But then that's not doing what one would want to claim, right? Like that's not like saying that there's some magical thing that you can do where you like get outside of derivability or provability. It's rather just that you can build a system that completely encapsulates another one, and then from the perspective of that bigger system that you've built, prove something about the smaller system that it contains.
That's right, and I think people hear that and what they think is, you have to add something outside the system. That's like the natural world, and you can't explain morality if you just have the natural world. You have to add in a supernatural thing like a god, and it's basically like the picture is so simple that it looks like what's happening with the Girdle stuff. And if you have a meta theory that has the right resources, then you can sort of get around the issue. And that's just like the same. I actually just think that is what he's doing here. He's trying to say the explanatory resources are so impoverished that you need to chuck extra stuff in order to explain this phenomenon, whatever it is, morality, free will, blah, blah, blah. And that's just what Girdle's doing. And there you go. They're the same. I think that's probably the most charitable reading of what he says, because otherwise it's basically just sort of gibberish and nonsense.
Right. So the other thing to be pointed out here is that this was all supposed to be about some way that it's false that science has disproven God or discredited religion or something like that. Or like that's what at the beginning of the clip, that's what he told us he was going to be talking about, and then he switched to talking about the incompleteness theorem. Now, there are some atheists, of course, who will say that science has disproven God's existence or something like that. I don't think that it's as straightforward as that. I think that here's a more sophisticated argument that I think is actually compelling, is to say, look, in the past, there have been scientific research programs that have been motivated on theological or supernatural grounds, or that pursued theological or supernatural hypotheses. In fact, as recently as the 20th century, you can look at examples like biblical archaeology. In the early 19th century, you can look at flood geology as another example. What's happened with every single one of those research programs is that they have all degenerated or eventually given up the supernatural. And that the research programs that have been the most successful have been those that simply did not invoke the supernatural or theology. What that tells, so that's a fact about the history of science. Now we can ask, what is the best explanation of that history? I think that the best explanation of that history is that we live in a world that doesn't contain a supernatural element. Now, of course, history could go differently in the future. One of the things that's worth pointing out about that history is that there were, in the supernatural or theologically driven research programs that have existed in the past, some of them were initially quite successful. So, for instance, in a previous episode, I mentioned the principle of least action that was introduced for theological reasons by Malpass. And I'm not sure I mentioned this in the past or not, but there was a group of geologists in the 18th and 19th centuries called catastrophists, and they had some success at predicting various things. And they also were the group that, I am told, developed the hypothesis that there was once an ice age. Now, even though those research programs had initially some success, they eventually degenerated and people had to do something different, it turned out. And I think what we've learned by doing science is that it's probably best done without the supernatural. But what that also tells us is that someday in the future, things could change. So I gave this explanation of the history of science. There's probably not the supernatural, but it also leaves the door open. It says, hey, look, tomorrow we might find something really surprising, right? It might be that you turn the James Webb Telescope in the right direction and all of a sudden you see Hebrew letters written out across the sky or something, or the stars align in the right way or whatever it is. And then it turns out that it's really productive to do theologically or supernaturally driven science after all. But at least where we stand now, it seems like the best explanation of the history is that there's nothing supernatural. I think that's a much more sophisticated way of looking at the relationship between these that gives you a negative result for religion.
Yeah, and I would add that there have been several discoveries that at least uncomfortable for Judeo-Christian faith. So the fact that the Genesis story doesn't look right, the fact that we've discovered there wasn't a global flood, the Exodus doesn't look like it happened. My favorite, of course, animals have been suffering for hundreds of millions of years before humans existed. All of these are scientific discoveries. Now, do we want to say they've killed God? I don't know exactly what that phrase means, but it certainly is detrimental to belief in God. And I don't think that the incompleteness theorem, is really going to undermine those statements. I just don't see what the relevance is.
Yeah. And the very last point is he says, some atheists say science killed God, which I actually don't recognize that sentence in anyone. I even don't think Richard Dawkins would say that.
But they have a picture of Nietzsche at the time.
Yeah, exactly. He flashes up a picture of Nietzsche. It's not what Nietzsche said either, actually. But
right.
The idea of the death of God obviously is a Nietzschean idea, but he doesn't say science killed God. I mean,
right.
We can get into, maybe we should do a Nietzsche episode one day, but well, obviously what Nietzsche said is a lot more nuanced and sort of pregnant with different interpretations and stuff, but it's not just the straightforward it's not what Dan just said. Even then, it's not. He's not making an abductive argument based on the history of science.
That's right.
So, wrong picture, wrong claim, wrong argument. The whole thing is just wrong. It's the wrong subject matter for him. He's not a philosopher. He doesn't know what he's talking about. He's a fucking idiot. Is basically my point. That's my summary.
Right. Well, look, I think we've gone quite long,
Yeah.
and we're only about halfway through all the clips in Ben's 10-minute film. So typical philosophers, going on and on until we go around in circles. But we hope to do an episode 2 where we will review the other arguments from Ben Shapiro. So we'll be talking about evolution, the Big Bang, fine-tuning, consciousness, and many other topics. And we will do that next time on the SciPhi Show. If you have any comments, any things where you thought we got it right or where we got it wrong, please leave it all in the comments. And we will see you next time on the SciPhi Show.